Welcome to the Earth Day episode of Secular Stories. I'm your host, Dr. David Orenstein. Today, we are very fortunate to have a scholar, an intellectual, an atheist author, and a personal friend of mine who I cherish very, very much, Dr. Hector Garcia with us. Dr. Garcia is a clinical psychologist, is an author, artist, humanitarian, and an advocate for mental health services. His current practice focuses on helping our soldiers and their families deal with the effects of war and also the effects of PTSD. As an author, Dr. Garcia has written two wonderful books, Alphagod, The Psychology of Religion, Violence and Oppression, and his latest book, Sex, Power, and Partisanship. I welcome you to our program.
David, good to see you.
Thank you. I really want to start with your background. Did you grow up in a household or have a family or live within a community that was faith-based?
I actually grew up in a community that was faith-based. I grew up in El Paso, Texas, on the New Mexico-Texas border, very Catholic. All the remnants of the conquest that came through that region hundreds of years ago kind of remained. But so I come from a big Mexican family, a big Mexican American family that is mostly Catholic, but I was not raised Catholic. My father was an atheist. At a time where it was kind of hard to be an atheist. He was a Darwinist, he was a child of the Great Depression and just happened to be a non-believer. So I wasn't raised that way, but it was all around me. So yeah.
Okay, well, that's interesting, because I think what we find is that in the atheist humanist community is that you either have a pivotal movement where you sort of break with the traditions, or you just never had it to begin with.
Yeah. In my case, that pivotal moment was the generation before me, and speaking of trauma, I mean, the reason my father was an atheist because his parents were just violently Catholic, if you could say that. They were just very violent towards their children, especially the boys in their family, but it was always hellfire and brimstone. We're going to beat Satan out of you kind of thing. And that, I think, just cauterized any love that he might ever have for religion. We weren't raised religious. He sought answers in other places, in psychology and biology and history, and left religion behind. So I was one of a very large extended family that just was not a believer and wasn't raised in the church.
So you can almost say Satan is the Alphagod of the anti-Alphagod.
Anti-Alphagod. Well,
yeah.
The character of Satan was a far nobler person than the character of Yahweh when you look at, deeds done or not. There's one scholar, Steve Wells, I think, when calculated all of the killings in the Bible attributed to God and those to Satan. I can't remember the number. It was like 2 million to 5 or something like that. So
cool. So let me ask you, because aside from your work in your books, you have a real job where you have dedicated a large part of your practice to helping those who have suffered in times of war. How did you get involved, or how did you build an interest in this field?
That has been my specialty. I use what are called evidence-based psychotherapies that have been studied through randomized controlled trials for years and years until they've kind of proven their efficacy and effectiveness. And PTSD is one of those specialties that responds very well to those kinds of treatments. So it's been my specialty for the past 16 years. And So
what do you find so extraordinary about PTSD in general? Do you see it throughout society as well, or I know you focus on soldiers primarily, but I mean, for instance, with COVID, I think we're all in some level suffering from PTSD because humans are such, social animals. And one thing that this terrible virus has done has made us really turn inwards. For at the worst part of it, we couldn't go out of our houses. We can't be with people. Do you have any thoughts on that?
well, I think I probably would guess more of depressive responses to COVID. I mean, there's, at least in the clinical literature, there's a difference between trauma in the vernacular sense, like a divorce can be traumatic, a loss of a job can be traumatic in that sense, but in terms of post-traumatic stress disorder, it's usually a threat to life. Either you witnessed somebody getting hurt or killed, or you nearly got killed or got assaulted or experienced something life-threatening, a natural disaster, sexual assault, child abuse, a motor vehicle accident. So something like that. So something like that threatens life or physical integrity. But it's really interesting because I have spent a lot of time thinking about and writing a little bit about the evolved nature of PTSD. So it's what it really is. It's an adaptation. It's an adaptation that fails to turn off when it's supposed to, because a lot of the symptoms of PTSD have adaptive value. Being on high alert, being able to get angry very quickly, not sleeping at night too deeply. I mean, in a very dangerous environment, that those kinds of behaviors serve you. They just don't serve you in regular peacetime civilian America, for example.
Sure. And then what happens to the person who's suffering from PTSD when they try to reemerge into civilian life? Is that it doesn't mesh.
Exactly. It's a mismatch, and so that's actually the topic of a chapter in an edited book that should be coming out in January on this very topic that I wrote. Explaining PTSD as an evolutionary mismatch. Our ancestral environments were incredibly brutal and dangerous. We're surrounded by predators. It's hard to imagine walking around where there's predators around you that could eviscerate you so easily. Our rival tribes, or venomous or poisonous fauna. I mean, our ancestral past was very dangerous.
Yes.
And so we developed a number of adaptations to cope with that kind of environment. But how we live has changed very drastically since we were hunter-gatherers. Sometimes there can be a mismatch between psychological adaptations and where we're living now. And PTSD is one of them we're probably going to talk about more. But PTSD, can be one of them because it turns on, and people just end up suffering a lot because their level of preparedness does not match with their surroundings.
Right. So it's more than just fight or flight, clearly. But it's part of that evolutionary mechanism of how you react to the stimuli that's around you.
Fight, flight, withdraw. Kind of nature really doesn't care about one's suffering if it aids survival. So survival over suffering, as it were, survival over quality of life, as it were.
Right. So as long as you're reproducing, regardless of how your head is, you evolutionarily you're doing fine because you're passing on your genes to the next generation, although you're suffering within yourself. So it's a fascinating field, and I know we've had private discussions about this as well, but I think it's very, very important, even though we're pulling out of, Afghanistan shortly, the military is still a huge part of America, and it has a huge budget, and we're still involved in other conflicts. And even if you're not involved in direct war, you could still suffer the effects of PTSD, couldn't you? I mean,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Assault, spousal abuse, child abuse,
Mm-hmm.
all those other types of traumas that I mentioned.
Sure.
But the main thing I want people to know, and I use every opportunity I can to express this, is that the treatments that we have are highly effective. They are effective. Most people who get one of the evidence-based treatments that we offer, by the time we're done, they don't meet full criteria for the disorder anymore. It
Wow.
treats it, and it treats it permanently. A lot of people don't know that, and they're short-term treatments.
What can you talk about? Maybe one or two of them, or
one of the ones that I do is called prolonged exposure therapy, and it involves repeated exposure to feared stimuli. So one of them is one's memories. So it's actually pretty simple. It's difficult, but it's pretty simple. So somebody would come into the therapy office and make a list of his or her top 3 worst memories. In the case of combat, there's often a lot of traumas, right? Sometimes there's singular traumas, but often, in the case of wartime experiences, there's more than one. And one by one, we make audio recordings of them. The patient will narrate them, go into a lot of detail, and take that recording and listen to it over and over and over. And essentially, the brain kind of gets tired of coming back to it, simply put. So nightmares dissipate very quickly. The memories don't go away. There's no way to scrub memories from our memory banks, but what happens is the adrenaline goes down. So when your trauma memory gets triggered by something, there's an adrenaline rush. The emotions are intense and they're raw and they're painful. It feels like it just happened. They're very disturbing and distracting. Every time you listen to one of these recordings, it comes down and further and further and further and further until they just don't bother you anymore. And that's absolutely life-changing. And so we do something similar with natural environments, like going to a grocery store, going to a restaurant, just doing that repeatedly until you habituate to that environment, until all these primitive centers of the brain say, okay, this isn't like a combat zone. This isn't like what I experienced before. I can turn out that adrenaline. I'll save it for a real emergency, and people can live, a normal life and be calm in a public space, for example.
It's life-changing, but it's life-saving, right? Because you're not just you're learning to adapt to the stimuli or lessen the effects, and that affects not only the person who's suffering, but their families, their communities. I know that there's a connection between PTSD and suicide. So if you're saving if you're able to teach someone to use whatever therapy to lessen that pain and suffering, I think it's wonderful and it's incredibly admirable.
Well, it's very rewarding, and we have science to thank for this. A lot of research came out of UPenn, and it's starting at early 60s, 70s, and so we decades of research looking at what works and what doesn't work. So science has given us a way to change people's lives and mitigate potentially decades of suffering. And for people who get it later in life, I hear all the time is I whatever time I have left, I can live it differently, and I can enjoy my life now. So it's very rewarding.
So let's talk a little bit, or a lot of actually, about Alphagod. I love the book. I think it's really wonderful. And for our viewers, could you talk a bit about what got you interested in writing Alphagod, and talk a little bit about it before we go into some of the details?
Yeah, I get asked that, and I've always I have so many different ideas swirling around in my head about Evo psych and biology and things I want to write about, and that was one of them. When I think back to probably I think it was my interest in the history of the region where I grew up. Ethnically, I'm what's known as mestizo. So that means like a mix of Spanish and native genetics, native blood. Some of my family came from the Copper Canyon region. They were Raramuri. They call themselves the light-footed people, these guys that run these 100-mile races wearing sandals, those guys. And others were conquistadors. So you come outside of the airport in El Paso and you see this giant equestrian, this giant bronze statue of a conquistador in all his armor rearing up on his horse. Well, I write about this guy in Alphagod. His name was Juan de Oñate. He came to that region in the late 1500s and conquered the area in the name of the church and the crown, all in the name of Christ, and committed some really horrible atrocities to the native people living in the region.
Genocides often with the church usually comes with the attacks on native people or indigenous people comes with an awful lot of genocide. But yes, please.
All across the world.
Yeah.
So as it turns out, we traced our Spanish side of the family to his expedition. So some of our family was on his boat when they landed on this hemisphere shores and did what they did. So I'm the product of religious conquest. So reading the history of the region and the Catholic Church and the power that they wielded and how they used this image of a territorial, vengeful, acquisitive God to spearhead all of that. I mean, I do write a fair amount about the conquista, about the conquest in my book. That was a big influence.
Did you find anything when you were doing your research, anything extraordinary that you didn't know before that really helped inform the rest of the book, or?
Most of it. I mean, you've written books before. It's like when you write, you're teaching yourself. You're like, you're teaching yourself about a topic. It's a moment of incredible discovery. So yeah, a lot of it. That's the joy of writing, of book writing for me.
It really is almost a personal journey, because sometimes when you start out thinking one thing and then you find all this research, it may change the whole premise of the work sometimes, or at least it really does help inform the rest of the work. Like, do you see, like, let's say recently, at CPAC, you had that gold Donald Trump statue. Do you see that as an outcome, as a sort of a form of Alphagod worship?
We evolved in dominance hierarchies for so much of our history, and true hunter-gatherers were far more egalitarian than we had become after we had become chiefdoms and city states and things like that. But there was always competition for rank, however much we managed to tamp that down. So I think the awe, the intuitive emotions that we experience in the face of dominant individuals, especially dominant males, really gets expressed, as we've seen in the last administration, and all walks of life. I mean, large, powerful men, we're drawn to them in this intuitive way. That's really, speaking of a evolutionary mismatch, it's irrational, because presidents would never get our back in a fight. Leaders of our ancestral past may have. We may have wanted to ally with the biggest, toughest male primate in our evolutionary past for protection, for example. But what president is really going to get our back in a physical fight these days?
Well, hopefully not our current one. I doubt our current one. He might be alpha, but I think he's I think a kinder and gentler alpha.
Sure, but we haven't escaped those dynamics. I mean, there's footage on YouTube of our current president and the former president trash talking each other, about how they could beat each other up. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. The
machismo, right? I mean, so you think then a lot of this comes not only from our evolutionary biology, but from the fact that, for 300,000 years that humans have been here, it's only in about the last 12,000 years or so that we've had quote unquote civilization where we've had stratification. Because if you're hunter and gatherers, everybody's sort of equal, you know, and it's a very small unit. But if you're talking about stratification, now you're talking about, you know, labor, you know, who's in charge, who sets the values, who sets the tone, who sets the mores, and you see that, of course, reflected then from going from, let's say, animism to once we started to create hierarchies in society, our gods became hierarchical as well.
Yeah.
You know, our gods became alpha.
Absolutely. I mean, I think there's a lot to unpack there. What gets missed, I think, a lot of times when we look at our history as hunter-gatherers is that it was relative egalitarianism. I mean, you look, there are some current hunter-gatherer tribes where there are some differences. You know, they're not as big as they are in a kingdom, but like powerful men get more food tributes, and they can have more than one wife sometimes.
Right. Polygamy.
But there's a limit to how much power that one can accrue, because you just can't, I mean, for one, you just can't store grains or other kind of riches the way you could once agriculture came around, right? But it definitely took off. But not only that, I mean, how long does it take to shape a certain trait? I mean, not that long. I mean, with that move towards more and more organization, more and more stratification, there were selection processes at work there. One study looked at the genome and found that at some point in our history, when along with the advent of agriculture, one man per every 13 reproduced. So there were men hoarding women, hoarding reproduction at a stunning level. How does that shape our psychology? You know, we have a lot to learn, but yes, it does. I think our religions did mirror, you know, the structure of our societies in many ways.
You know, you talk about oppression in Alphagod, and you talk about violence. Can you talk a little bit about that specifically, how it relates to religion?
Well, I mean, starting with this notion of God, I mean, you know, our notions of gods across the pantheon of gods across the world they're usually all the omnis, you know, omnipresent, omnipotent, having, you know, never dying, not of bodily form, but a really intense interest in resources, in territory, in submission displays. You know, so
there's almost a primatology to it.
There's a clear primatology to it, or so I argue, right? There's a primatology to it. I mean, and they're male. I mean, that is classic male mate competition expressed. Men have a reproductive incentive to oppress, to have more than, for inegalitarianism, because men can reproduce with every single copulation, right? And that is no way to excuse oppression by saying it's natural, therefore it's okay,
right?
But I think that is the root of oppression, competition for resources, competition for mates, and it gets expressed in religion, certainly.
So, I mean, being a Catholic, I mean, you look at the structure of the Catholic Church, and it's all about Alphagod, right? Even if it's not the God, right? Because the Pope, of course, is Christ on earth, right? And then you have the stratification of the bishops and down all the way down to the parish priest, where you have the God, if you will, in its male form, really taking all of the resources. I'm talking from a social point of view now, not from a biological point of view, but you have that hierarchy, and so it shows in our biology, and it comes out, especially in these male-dominated patriarchal religions, as power, and as you say, as oftentimes with power, since power doesn't give itself up voluntarily, it comes. There's also a sense of threat or doom or violence because of it.
You're right. I mean, the church hierarchy is literally a primate dominance hierarchy.
Right.
With the Pope at its apex, sitting on top of a throne, gilded throne in a palace. And looking at the history of the popes, it's stunning. I mean, the popes had wielded so much power.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that I learned that I didn't really fully grasp. I mean, they had control of an army, the papal army, and they would invade neighboring city states and capture all their resources. Some popes literally would have killed another pope to gain access to the throne. There's all kinds of sexual intrigue going on. One pope literally turned the papal palace into a literal brothel. It was stunning to read that. So, and it did concern resources. I mean, bishops in the Middle Ages owned these vast plantations filled with serfs, like working their plantations, their vineyards. They were wealthy individuals, powerful individuals.
Yeah. So it's because and you haven't even touched on the Crusades, right? I mean,
I'm not even touching the Crusades, right?
Right. So do you see Alphagods in secularism sometimes as well? Like, do you see it show up not just in the social aspects of religion, but like when I teach anthropology, and I think about gods and how the United States has become so secular, the first thing I talk to my students about is like the Marvel universe. Like there are a lot of nuns now, right? People who aren't religion, or they're not going to church and everything, and they say they're atheists, but they love the stories, right? They love Thor, and they love, so there's, I think one of the reasons why the Marvel universe has been so successful financially is because we've moved away from the religious stories and we've transferred that to our entertainment.
But it all has evolutionary undertones. I mean, one thing that I've noticed in movie after movie after movie after movie, there's always some male mate competition happening. If there's always a protagonist who takes the woman, kidnaps her, beats her, whatever, and there's a hero who's fighting either another man or a demon or, a demigod or whatever to rescue that woman and get that woman in the end. It's all of this stuff plays out on this ancient psychology. We're poised to find dominant male figures, to revere them and respect them, and in some cases give resources up to them, or find them just captivating, so that you're really drawn into the theme of a movie or or whatever you see on the screen.
Like, do you think our social controls, like the philosophy of humanism, do you think that helps bring us to move away from Alphagod? In other words, can we use the structures of our constructs of like our philosophies to tamp down these ancient and biological and gene-based parts of our genome?
I do think so. I think secularism, is kind of an insurance policy, against that, because, look at what happened in the Middle Ages. So, the Catholic Church sold indulgences, right? We will, if you give us money, we're gonna lessen your time in hell or in purgatory. Right. We're going to protect you. We're going to intervene for this dominant, with this dominant male god who's going to protect you from these things. Right? The need for protection, the intuitive need for protection, the ancient need for protection, tied into these powerful emotion centers of the brain, they get enacted when we think of dominant male gods, and it's often used against us. Right? It's often used to manipulate us. So anytime you've kind of taken that out of the equation, I think people can think more clearly about, okay, how about this life? How about I don't need protection from the terrors of the afterlife or from death itself, because it's inevitable.
Right.
And focus on this life. So I do think that's a start, and really any any endeavor that promotes critical thinking, questioning, which is something you don't do with an alpha god. You don't question a dominant male's authority unless you're ready to get trounced or to fight.
Right.
You know, there's a built-in circumspection when it comes to questioning those in positions of power. There's a fear involved.
That's a fantastic point. Absolutely. Because if you're questioning, your only two options are to try to attain that status or run away from that status in the end. So I think it's a good point. So yeah, I mean, I tend to agree with you as well, because and if you look at certain countries around the world that are less religious, they're more egalitarian, even if they are stratified.
Right.
You know, they are, you know, there's less of a God did it, and there's more of a we have to live in the present tense.
Right. Right. Yeah. Yes. And you know, maybe there's less of a willingness to acquiesce. If you really believe that the most powerful male in the universe wants you to lower yourself, wants you to give up resources, wants you to not question authority. And it's always, you know, people who seem to represent that being and know what he wants.
Right. The interpreter
proceeds on his behalf and receives resources on his behalf. Right. That's the ruse.
Right. And who was it? I can't remember who said this, that it's always amazing how the person who speaks for God, God always, God and he always agree on everything. So, yeah, you know, there's got to be something going on there. Can you talk a little bit maybe about your newest book?
Sex, Power, and Partisanship.
Yes, please.
So I wrote that in the wake of I began writing it in the wake of the 2016 election, just trying to make sense of what just happened, you know. I mean, not only the Donald Trump presidency, but which, I mean, I have not really pulled any punches with my opinion of Donald Trump as a leader. But what happened to the fabric of American society, it was just, we were at each other's throats. You know, we're literally fighting each other in the streets. I mean, the whole world was just aghast. We were just stunned and confused. So my attempt was like to try and explain, okay, what is partisanship? You know, I think the evolutionary sciences are good at asking that basic question: what is blank? What is God? What is partisanship? What is love? What is, you know, what is it really? What does it boil down to? So that's what I tried to answer. And, you know, a lot of it comes down to some very ancient psychology designed to help us survive and to reproduce. And so on a very broad scale, that's what that book was about.
So we're still basically monkeys wearing Nikes, basically.
Or leisure suits or business.
Right. Right. So with your second book now, are you talking about the idea of, let's say, tribalism, right? Consensus building, different groups joining together, even if they're not totally in agreement. Like, for instance, the Democratic and the Republican Party are made up of all these constituencies, right? They're not necessarily monolithic.
Right.
So when I hear the word constituency, I immediately think of tribe.
Right.
Because we're replacing it with a political word, but really it's all these different tribes banding together to be something organically much bigger than itself, with its own set of values and ultimate positions to move politics forward and everything.
Oh, that's accurate. Well, you know, the thing is, we are remarkable cooperators as Homo sapiens. We cooperate on a scale that no other animal has ever seen. You know, and I don't want to diminish that, you know, but we do strain against our tribalistic psychology. You know, we evolved in small groups, topping off at about 150, 200 people. And in many ways, those groups were insular. I mean, there was communication between tribes, but we were also at nearly constant warfare with one another as well.
Right.
And so sometimes, we strain against that psychology and it breaks down and we end up fighting each other in the streets, especially when those in positions of power prod those that evolved tribalistic psychology purposefully for a certain response. And so we have to understand that psychology if we want functioning, stable societies.
And when you talk about cooperation and everything, I can't think of any other human construct that we have developed that is more prone to cooperation than science. If you look at science as a human construct built over the last several hundred years, if not thousand, you find that it's very rare that you find the person working in the back of their garage or their laboratory who is going to scream out Eureka. Now science is, whether it's the ISS or whether it's a Large Hadron Collider or whether it's finding a cure for coronavirus, it is international. It is the voice of reason spoken in multiple languages. Do you think following that type of construct would lead us away from the need for alphagods?
Maybe not just purely conducting science, right? Because we can also develop technologies to blow the shit out of each other.
Right.
What is, I mean, the military technology is one of the biggest drivers of scientific innovation in the world, right? But I think that ethos, certainly, right, of cooperating, of being rational, and I think we need to apply that to psychological science. I think the psychological sciences need to inform policy. They need to inform how we conduct human affairs, and especially the evolutionary sciences. Just because it's our most ancient psychologies that tend to be the most disruptive. They tend to create havoc with that cooperative process so often. It's the reason we covet scientific information and or go to war with one another or fight each other in the streets. So I think the ethos is there. How we translate that to everyday life, that's the trick.
That's the trick. And people have written about this. I mean, Pinker has written about this, about how the more compassionate and empathetic we are, the less violent we are, the more cooperative we become. The more cooperative we become, the less there's need for war. And we see that. But yeah, there are institutions like the military or like certain political parties, and every party has some element to it. It's not just one or the other. Sure. We'll have this need to acquire, right? We'll have this need to acquire power. Anything else you want to share about the second book?
Well, I spent a lot of time talking about what the appeal of Donald Trump was, and it really kind of ties into that need for protection, that look to larger, stronger males, or at least those pretending to be stronger or projecting strength. It's stunning that in the modern day size would matter, but it does matter. I mean, most of throughout most of our history as a country, the taller of the presidential candidates won the presidential election. Taller men are usually higher up in business and in church hierarchy. It predicts whether or not you're a bishop or a priest. So it's this really ancient psychology that can blind us to one's competence, to the competence of our leaders.
Absolutely. I mean, sexual dimorphism, we still play into that. Even if we're not conscious about it, it's still operating within us as primates, as mammals.
especially among the more fearful. And, fear, does express itself on the natural curve. And there are some of us in the population who are highly fearful, especially of outsiders, and some of us who are way less fearful. And as it turns out, that fear in general, especially fearing outsiders, predicts where somebody falls on the liberal conservatism spectrum. The more fearful you are in general, the more conservative you're going to be.
And probably the more religious you're going to be as well.
And probably the more religious you're going to be.
Right, because you're going to depend on the Alphagod or the philosophy.
The promises of protection from death itself in the case of most religions, right? But, the problem is that those fears make us vulnerable to manipulation. And that's what I want. That's what I want people to understand. If you don't understand your evolved psychology, others who know it, others who understand it, are going to use it to manipulate you, no question. And that absolutely takes place in American politics and politics around the globe. I mean,
right.
So political actors know the research.
Right.
It's pretty clear when you deconstruct what is said in the media or on a platform. It's clear that they know the research. They have tons of money to throw out at gathering data.
Yeah, and use that research to manipulate the masses. Absolutely.
Via fear.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's not just marketing, if you will. You know what I mean? It's not just manipulating people to buy a product. It's manipulating people to vote for things that even are not even in their interest or self-interest in the end, but because their fear buttons have all been activated in the back of their neck, and about the other, about their own place,
their own position in the hierarchy. I mean,
absolutely.
So that can get prodded, so blatant. When you understand what's happening, it just becomes so obvious. I mean, that's the thing about the evolutionary sciences. I mean, what so many people tell me in reading my books, like, oh my gosh, that's so obvious now that I see it. And that's how reading in these sciences is for me. I'm like, oh my gosh, of course. But it's typically the older our impulses are, the more hidden they are from everyday conscious awarenesses. They just work naturally. They're seamless.
Right.
So my hope is that those sciences, just popular culture understands them more, so that we can make freer choices, whatever kind of choice, political choices, economic choices, whatever, as consumers.
Sure.
It is.
Let me just backtrack a little bit. How good does it feel when someone comes up to you and says, holy shit, I read your book and now I understand X, Y, and Z?
Oh, it's incredibly rewarding.
Isn't it cool?
I mean, you've had that. It feels great.
Yeah.
That's why I write. I mean, and just because so many people have done that for me, that is the cooperative enterprise of science. I mean, I read a lot of science books, and we just build on other knowledge, like you were saying.
Yeah.
To have one brick in there, I'm happy about that.
Yeah.
But I can contribute. So,
brother. So, Hector, I don't want to take up more of your time, but what's the next mountain you're planning to climb?
Oh gosh,
writing anything new? Or are you? You're also, I should say, to let our audience know that you've done 2 TED Talks, correct?
I've done 2 TED Talks. One was about PTSD, and the other one was about why we go to war. What are the evolutionary motivations for making war?
And those are on your website as well. Do you want to plug your website by any chance?
Hector-Garcia.com.
Beautiful.
I don't know, David. I got a ton of book ideas. Is getting the time to write them. That's something else. I'm not really in academia. I'm mostly a clinician at this point in my career, but I got lots of books in me. I am developing, my YouTube channel, and I think that's a really fun way to communicate the ideas you and I have been talking about. I may delve into that. We'll see.
Wonderful. Well, I want to thank you for your time tonight, and let you know again, you have my friendship forever, and I think you're such a great guy and such a pleasure to talk with.
Oh man, the feeling's mutual. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Very enjoyable.
And I'm going to get to Austin, so I'm planning to see you in Texas soon.
Yes, Austin, baby. It's a great city.
Yeah.
Go listen to some music, maybe.
Yeah, sounds good, brother.
All right.
Okay. Thank you.